On November 29, 1989, 60,000 people packed the Tokyo Dome to watch pro wrestling. It was a historic event that would shatter box office records in Japan and even the US. But fans weren't there to see Antonio Inoki or New Japan Pro Wrestling. They weren't there to watch Giant Baba's All Japan or the deathmatch spectacles of Atsushi Onida's FMW. They were there for Shoot Style, for the UWF. A promotion on top of the Japanese pro wrestling world, but destined to die just 1 year later. Born out of a New Japan scandal, imploding in on itself not once but twice, and leaving a profound mark not only on pro wrestling, but MMA as well, this is the story of how real wrestling took over Japan. This is the story of the UWF. Like so many pro wrestling organizations in Japan, the UWF was born out of a talent exodus, in this case from New Japan Pro Wrestling in 1984. You see, by the early 1980s, New Japan was experiencing a high point in its decade-long history. Founder and top star Antonio Inoki, along with a new generation of talent, were ushering in this era of unprecedented success, in part thanks to a groundbreaking invasion angle between New Japan and wrestlers from a recently defunct promotion called the IWE. And no small part of that was down to decisions made by New Japan booker Hisashi Shinma. More on him soon. The good times were rolling, but not everyone was happy. A certain rising star by the name of Akira Maeda perpetually stuck in the mid-card, for example, and he wasn't the only one. While business was up, the wrestlers' paychecks were not. The reason was that some of these profits from this newfound company's success were allegedly being funneled into a failed side business operated by Inoki and Shinma. Now, the details of this might not be strictly relevant to this story, but they're too weird not to at least touch on. This side business was a biotech company connected to the Brazilian government. See, at the time, Brazil was looking into alternate fuel sources, and refined sugarcane alcohol was one of them. But the waste that was generated from the refinement process was a big problem. And Inoki thought he had the solution: turn the byproduct from the sugarcane alcohol into animal feed for livestock using some cocktail of enzymes. It did not work, and the project became one big money pit. According to wrestling and MMA writer Zach Arnold, quote, "The fermentation process failed, and combined with the inflation of currency between Brazil and Japan, the project gathered enormous debt in no time." End quote. This caused quite a scandal within New Japan. Inoki was removed as president of the company, and Shinma was outright fired. But Shinma was far from just some business partner of Inoki's, or a suit in the New Japan office. Shinma was the one who bestowed the wildly successful Tiger Mask gimmick on Satoru Sayama, discovered Akira Maeda, and booked the interpromotional style matches that were so important to New Japan's success at the time. So he hatched a plan: start a new promotion, bring Inoki and other stars over, get a TV deal on a rival station, and rule the wrestling world once again. That was the dream. However, reality didn't quite work out that way. Despite the failed business venture and resulting scandal, Inoki never left New Japan. But Maeda did, and he wasn't alone. Rusher Kimura, Ryuma Go, Mach Hayato, and Gran Hamada also joined him. And a short time later, so did the men who would pioneer and shape Shoot Style along with Maeda: Nobuhiko Takada, Yoshiaki Fujiwara, Kazuo Yamazaki, and Tiger Mask himself, Satoru Sayama. The latter group were all wrestlers with a background and interest in martial arts, and they were all, except for Sayama, trained by Karl Gotch. Together, they'd form the Universal Wrestling Federation, or UWF. And in the UWF, they would develop a philosophy and presentation of pro wrestling known as Shoot Style today. And so this would be a good time to ask, what exactly is Shoot Style? In the vernacular of pro wrestling, the term shoot means real. the opposite of a work, which means fake. When one wrestler shoots on another in the ring, they're hurting or attempting to hurt their opponent for real. A shoot interview with a wrestler is likewise a discussion of the wrestling business as it exists behind the curtain, not in storyline terms. So, is shoot-style wrestling actually real then? No. Shoot-style is professional wrestling that takes its inspiration and techniques from legitimate combat sports, primarily catch wrestling, a very real grappling martial art that dates back about 150 years to England. Arm bars, leg locks, suplexes, a lot of the stuff you see in the UWF comes from this tradition, thanks to catch and professional wrestler Karl Gotch. Because of this grounding in combat sports, shoot style has the appearance of reality, especially back in the 1980s, when there wasn't a UFC or Pride Fighting Championship to compare it to. A lot of the pageantry that comes with professional wrestling is dialed down in shoot style as well, with early UWF cards feeling pretty harsh and stark in their presentation. It is predetermined and it is a performance, but one with an element of danger, where wrestlers often throw stiff strikes and push the envelope of what is simulated versus what is real. Despite the fights being a work, UWF wrestlers were apparently told to protect themselves at all times, which tells you a lot. Now let's get back to the UWF. As wildly influential as it would become, this original incarnation of the UWF wasn't all that successful as a business. Yakuza scandals, television deals that fell through, and political infighting all contributed to the downfall of the promotion, and so did a rather infamous shoot incident involving Akira Maeda and Satoru Sayama. But we'll get to that. The UWF's first show took place on April 11th, 1984, in front of about 3,000 people, with a main event headlined by Akira Maeda and Dutch Mantel, of all people. The rest of the card was filled out by Mexican luchadors, American wrestlers, and Japanese veterans like Rusher Kimura. Not exactly what you'd expect on the first outing from the legendary and influential UWF. Because of course, shoot style didn't come out of the box fully formed on day one. And over the short year-and-a-half lifespan of the UWF, a stylistic shift took place. Early UWF matches resembled more traditional pro wrestling, but with a much stronger emphasis on working towards submissions like arm bars and leg locks. Satoru Sayama was still wearing his tiger mask. Pile drivers were used, and so were the occasional high-risk maneuvers from the top of the turnbuckle. But as time went on and this group of shoot-style pioneers began to find their identity, the masks came off. There were less pinfall finishes, and nobody got vertical. Shoot style was evolving before fans' eyes, and they were witnessing pro wrestling history, whether they knew it or not. The UWF's core roster was tight. As far as full-timers go, it was mostly the wrestlers trained and loyal to Karl Gotch, and then of course Sayama. Looking back now, it's hard to appreciate just how different the UWF was at the time. Matches were intently focused on real submission techniques, they were stiff as hell, and it was all presented as legitimate combat sports competition. Sayama literally wrote a book exposing the business. Maeda went around telling Japanese media that other companies' matches were fake. It really was something of a revolution in Japanese pro wrestling. By all accounts, while the UWF was hardly approaching the attendance scales of New Japan or All Japan, it was carving out its own niche in the Tokyo area. Building from that base, the company could conceivably have amassed a loyal, hardcore fan base, and then begun converting traditional pro wrestling fans to their ranks if given a little more time and a little more stability. But the UWF quickly began to experience significant pressure both from outside and inside sources. Several different television deals fell through for the company, the first with Fuji TV. According to ProWrestlingHistory.com, an agreement with the television company imploded before the first UWF show ever took place, when contracts for Riki, Choshu, and Satoru Sayama couldn't be put in place in time. A separate TV deal is also said to have collapsed following a Yakuza scandal. Apparently, after UWF President Noboru Urata and a Yakuza member were both arrested in 1984 for threatening Satoru Sayama's former business manager. And while the business side of the promotion spun its wheels, tensions behind the scenes began to boil over, especially between Maeda and Sayama. The two men never got along, each disagreeing over the future direction of the UWF and this new shoot style of pro wrestling as a whole. Not to mention clashing over who was supposed to be booked as the real ace of the promotion. Maeda was of that Karl Gotch lineage we talked about earlier: catch wrestling, hooking, groundwork, submissions. Sayama, well, he was more in the kickboxing camp: strikes, stiff kicks, the stand-up game. And every time these two men met in the ring, the match would become very stiff very quickly, sometimes downright uncooperative. This pattern of antagonism in and out of the ring boiled over in a 1985 match in Osaka. After several minutes of drawn-out ground submissions and stiff strikes, some of which were clearly not pulled, Maeda hits Sayama with a sharp knee to the midsection. He doubles over in pain and drops to a squat position with one hand on the mat to steady himself, eventually needing to hold the ropes to stay upright. Now, this is almost always reported as a knee to the groin, but if you watch the footage closely, it's much higher than that. Regardless, it clearly knocks the wind out of the former Tiger Mask, and the crowd is visibly confused when the referee calls for the bell, and the match just ends abruptly after Sayama can't continue. This was seemingly Maeda's way of making his displeasure with Sayama's behavior and management known, and it would not be the last time he'd air his grievances in the ring. Sayama called it quits shortly after, and with their biggest draw now gone and financial pressures mounting around them, the UWF folded just 9 days later. The company's final show took place on September 11, 1985 in Korakuen Hall. While the second incarnation of the UWF is usually more remembered and more revered by wrestling fans today, this first pioneering effort is fascinating to look back on 40 years later. It was a historic first step into shoot style, and it does include a few great matches. But at this point, the story of the UWF very much becomes the story of Akira Maeda. Maeda and the UWF roster would return to New Japan Pro Wrestling in 1986. Learning from their earlier success working with the former IWE wrestlers, New Japan positioned the UWF boys as a sort of separate promotion within the promotion, and ultimately an invading force, a group of young upstarts bringing their shoot-style revolution to the more traditional establishment of New Japan. By the way, if you're wondering whatever became of Satoru Sayama, well, he walked away from pro wrestling and founded his own legitimate fighting organization called Shuto. Shuto is both the name of the kickboxing-influenced fighting style and the organization itself, and I've seen people describe it as the first true MMA promotion in the world. Now, back to pro wrestling. In New Japan, the UWF Army would blend the hardcore grounded style they developed with more traditional pro wrestling. Wearing matching tracksuits and keeping to themselves like some kind of wrestling street gang, they do battle with Inoki and his crew of loyalists in blockbuster tag matches in front of very hot crowds. Maeda himself was a much bigger star coming back into the company than when he left a few years prior, and his legend would only grow after controversial incidents with Andre the Giant and Riki Choshu. He and Inoki were, in many ways, very similar men, and you could rightly think of Maeda as the heir apparent to Inoki's own throne. Ultimately, this UWF New Japan war would have led to a blockbuster program between Maeda and Inoki. At least that's the assumption, because that singles match never happened. By late 1987, Maeda was out of New Japan Pro Wrestling for the second time, and not by choice. In one of the most infamous shoot incidents in wrestling history, he walked up to Riki Choshu during a tag match and casually kicked him in the face, full force, breaking his orbital bone and sidelining one of New Japan's biggest stars for months. If you're asking yourself why he would do such a thing, well, I've got a full video dedicated just to Akira Maeda's shoot incidents, and it goes into more detail. But the common belief here is that Maeda was lashing out at Choshu over resentment and maybe a little bit of jealousy. See, Choshu had also recently returned from working in another company, in his case, arch rivals All Japan Pro Wrestling, and he was instantly catapulted to the top spot on the card when he made his return, possibly leapfrogging Maeda and usurping his rightful place as the next king of New Japan. There is, of course, the possibility that this was just a big accident, a stiff UWF-style kick thrown at Choshu without giving him enough time to react and protect himself. Whatever the reason, it very nearly caused an all-out brawl during the match and took out one of New Japan's biggest draws in Choshu for 2 months. Maeda was suspended from New Japan and told to go wrestle in Mexico for a while as a sort of punishment. But at this point, Akira Maeda was interested in little else than being the top guy, and if that wasn't going to happen in New Japan, he'd make sure it happened somewhere else. And so that was the end for Akira Maeda in New Japan. He packed his bags for a second time and would never return to the promotion. Nobuhiko Takada, Kazuo Yamazaki, Yoji Anjo, and Tatsuo Nakano followed Maeda on his way out. And just a handful of months later, the reborn UWF was announced. Having laid the groundwork with the original UWF and growing his own legend as the king of shoot style back in New Japan, Maeda's UWF 2.0 took off like a rocket. Their first show, appropriately titled Starting Over, took place at Korakuen Hall in May of 1988. It was a 3-match card that sold out in less than 15 minutes. And things just got bigger from there. A few months later, in August, they brought 12,000 people to Tokyo's Ariake Coliseum. In January of 1989, they'd bring a capacity crowd to the Nippon Budokan to see a mix of UWF wrestlers and combat sports outsiders in the mid-card, and Maeda take on Takada in the main event. Just over a year after their first show, they'd packed 23,000 people into Osaka Stadium for a show that netted $1.7 million at the gate. In August, they'd sell out Yokohama Arena, bringing in 17,000 people to watch a 5-card match that this time included only UWF full-time talent. Quite simply, the UWF was absolutely on fire. They had major drawing power in the form of Maeda. They were on the cutting edge of a hot new style of wrestling presentation, and they had the financial backing to stabilize them. A man named Hachiro Tanaka, president of a massive eyeglass company called Megane Super, was the primary sponsor of the UWF. A wrestling fan himself, he was eventually looking at starting his own wrestling promotion, something that would have existential consequences for the UWF, but we'll get to that. By this point, the core UWF wrestlers had been reunited with Yoshiaki Fujiwara, who brought with him several young prospects, including 2 by the name of Masakatsu Funaki and Minoru Suzuki. Just a few years later, these 2 youngsters would have a profound effect on not just pro wrestling in Japan, but mixed martial arts competition globally. But for now, they're just 2 very entertaining youngsters who added some much-needed depth to a UWF roster that was always on the thin side. In November of 1989, Maeda and the UWF would make history, bringing 60,000 people to the Tokyo Dome for a show called U Cosmos. That event would shatter wrestling box office numbers both in Japan and the US, netting nearly $3 million just at the gate. According to Dave Meltzer, with merchandise sales and closed-circuit TV revenue added in, that number becomes an astounding $5.6 million. And the event brought production values to the live crowd as well. According to Chris Charlton in his book Eggshells, a high-profile company called Mother Enterprises, best known for putting on live concerts, was the one handling the live production. Now, the U Cosmos card itself is an interesting one. Like something out of a Tekken game story mode, each match had a Japanese UWF wrestler paired with a foreign fighter. There was amateur wrestler Dwayne Kozlowski against Nobuhiko Takada, Yoji Anjo facing down a Muay Thai champion, Yamazaki taking on a judoka called Chris Dolman, Fujiwara paired with a kickboxer named Dick Fry. And tucked away in the midcard, a match between future UFC heavyweight champion Maurice Smith and a young, fresh-faced Minoru Suzuki. Maeda was naturally in the main event, but his opponent is a bizarre one. It's a man called Willy Wilhelm, a judoka from the Netherlands who competed in the 1984 Olympics and won some medals at the World Judo Championships. This would be his first, and it looks like only appearance in a pro wrestling ring. Not exactly the kind of opponent who can sell tickets based on name value or look good on a poster. And the match itself is hardly even memorable. It's a far cry from the epic Kings Road clashes of All Japan and the Nippon Budokan, or the thrilling battles of pro wrestling prowess that New Japan would hold in the Dome over the coming years. But therein lies the proof of just how incredibly popular Akira Maeda and his UWF were. He could have fought a broomstick and still filled the Tokyo Dome. But he wasn't the only one developing star power. By this point, a clear rival to Maeda's throne had appeared in the form of Nobuhiko Takada. The majority of the UWF Reborn's events were headlined by at least one of these two men, with shows often main evented by the younger Takada giving chase to the now veteran Maeda. And Takada would end up playing an essential role in the legacy of the UWF, but that's a story for the next video. Now might be a good time to touch on the rules of the UWF. Very shortly into its second incarnation, pinfalls were discarded and a 5 knockdown rule was instituted. If the match didn't end by knockout or submission, 5 knockdowns would count as a TKO. The original UWF cards were often in danger of feeling kind of samey, with the same repeated sequence of kicks, armbar attempts, ankle locks, and very little pro wrestling flair to the presentation. But the UWF Reborn started to incorporate progressively more showmanship. By 1990, their shows become pretty damn entertaining from start to finish. Even if you're not strictly into shoot style as a wrestling subgenre, it's undeniably entertaining to watch Yoji Anjo in his garish tights go 110 miles an hour, or Kazuo Yamazaki to put on shoot style clinics, to watch the dramatics of a young Minoru Suzuki, or experience the big match feel of Takada versus Maeda. And through 1990, the sellouts continued. They ran the Budokan several more times and came back to Yokohama Arena, drawing capacity crowds and racking up incredible numbers at the box office. And then, out of the blue, it stopped. The last UWF show was in front of 4,000 people in a small city gym venue on December 1st, 1990. Maeda wasn't even on the card. Like its original incarnation, this new, wildly successful UWF lasted just a few years before it imploded. So what happened? Well, for once, it did not involve Maeda shooting on someone. No, the death of the UWF Reborn was far more political in nature. By 1990, it seemed that tensions had begun to arise between Maeda and the UWF president, a man called Shinji Jin, regarding the company's finances. By 1988, Maeda had allegedly asked Jin to see the company's accounting books, and this request was denied. Their relationship after that was, let's say, rocky from there on. Now, remember Hachiro Tanaka, the eyeglasses mogul who ponied up all that sponsorship cash? Well, by this time, he'd gone and started his own wrestling promotion called Super World Sports. SWS was led by none other than Genichiro Tenryu, and Tanaka was throwing buckets of cash at the project. Because of his earlier financial support, Shinji Jin wanted the UWF to work with the SWS and lend them some wrestling talent. Maeda, to put it lightly, was not impressed. He felt that working with a more traditionally theatrical pro wrestling organization would destroy the UWF's credibility, being, of course, an organization built on realism and using legitimate fighters in their programs. There was a war going on behind the scenes, with the company's top star on one side and the president on the other. Maeda was so frustrated, he made some cryptic public comments alluding to protecting young talent from meddling forces. He was quickly suspended by Jin for these comments. Maeda made another request to see the company's books, but again was denied. What happens next is a somewhat convoluted series of secret meetings and boycotts and bluffs, but it resulted in the wrestlers siding with Maeda against the president. Shinji Jin's response was to fire all the talent and announce the closure of the UWF. And just like that, the dream was over. This rather complicated timeline of events that led to the implosion of the second UWF was largely sourced from an article on IgaPro, a write-up from ProRes historian Cameron Lee, and material from the Wrestling Observer newsletter. It can be quite difficult to find reliable sources on this kind of thing, so I'm in debt to those folks. Soon after the implosion of the reborn UWF, the company's stars started carving up the roster and forming their own promotions to carry on the legacy. There was the UWFI, Nobuhiko Takada's wildly successful evolution of the brand that mixed shoot style with the glitzy presentation of more mainstream pro wrestling. Fighting Network Rings, Maeda's next project, that would take shoot style in an even more hardcore direction and eventually morph into a legitimate MMA organization. And perhaps the very birth of modern MMA in the founding of Pancrase by Minoru Suzuki, Masakatsu Funaki, and Ken Shamrock after they abandoned Pro Wrestling Fujiwara Gumi. It was a momentous splintering of talent, one that had ripple effects throughout pro wrestling and MMA, and that's what we'll be talking about in part 2 of this story. If you've made it this far in the video, there's a good chance that Japanese pro wrestling history and stories is something you're into, and hopefully you like what I do here on the channel. It's my goal to produce the best storytelling content in the world of pro res, and thanks to all the awesome support that you've shown me over the last 8 months on this channel, I've decided to open a Patreon. This isn't something that I take lightly, and I think that asking people for their support is a big step. That's why I wanted to make sure that the content I was producing was worthy of that. These videos take a huge amount of resources and editing to make, but I'm not willing to compromise on quality. So getting a little extra support from some of you will make a big difference in me being able to do more of this. For those of you willing and able to show your support this way, I'm still thinking about the best ways I can bring value to Patreon subscribers. Right now, I'm considering things like early access to new content, voting for video topics, exclusive Q&A videos with me, and down the road, if we get enough members, Patreon exclusive videos and a Discord. There's a link in the description of this video and on my YouTube page if you want to check it out. If that's not something that's for you right now, that is totally okay. I'm not going to stop publishing high quality content on this channel, and I'm not going to compromise on quality. So I'll see you on part 2 of the history of the UWF.